Hello again. As you know, I am Eli, the computer guy, and this is the next class in the Windows Server 2012 track. This is Introduction to File and Share Permissions on Windows Server 2012. So as I talked about before, where Active Directory is one of the main components, one of the main reasons why enterprises use Microsoft servers, the File and Share Permissions is one of the main pieces of functionality that makes Active Directory so cool and useful. Basically, using File and Share Permissions, you can very easily give access to files, folders, printers to the users that you want to have access to those items, and restrict that access from the users you don't want to be able to have access. Not only that, but you can refine what individual users can do to say whether you want them to be able to do things like simply be able to read a document. Or do you want them to be able to read and write to a document? Do you want them to be able to execute? Do you want them to be able to list the files, the contents in a folder? You can do all of that through using File and Share Permissions that are part of the Windows Server 2012 suite. This is kind of like one of those, again, the cornerstone things you're going to find in enterprise environments. So again, whether you're a Linux fanboy or a Mac fanboy, even if you completely and utterly hate Microsoft, you hate Windows, this is something you should know, because you are going to run into it in the real world. And if you can't run into it in the real, or if you can't deal with it in the real world, well, you're probably not going to be working unless you work in a very specialized Linux or Unix environment. Now with this class, again, as I've talked about, I have a number of Server 2012 books that I use in order to create these classes so that I can do my own research. This is one of those classes, again, that you need to go out and you need to buy a Windows Server 2012 book. Again, I like Windows Server 2012 Unleashed by SAMS. SAMS is a very good company. Whatever you do, though, go out and buy a book, especially once you get into dealing with these permissions, because permissions is kind of, how do you explain permissions? Permissions is a bit like algebra. It's one of those things that once you understand it, darn, it's easy. Wow, how could anybody not understand this stuff, right? But until you do understand it, yeah, it can just seem like the most esoteric, stupid thing in the world. So make sure you go out and buy a book just so you can read up on this stuff and really understand what's going on. Because once the light bulb goes off in your head, this stuff will seem really, really easy. Until then, it's going to seem a little convoluted because, well, it kind of is a little convoluted, really, at the end of the day. And also, if you're going to be playing with permissions, this is one of those times, again, you need to have your own computer lab, and you need to start playing with this. You need to create multiple groups, you need to create multiple users, multiple computers, and actually start playing with this. This is one of those, again, the skill sets that's very tactile. This is not like subnetting, where you kind of either know it or you don't know it. This is one of those things that you've got to play with, you've got to fool around with, you've got to break, you got to fix, and then once you do, you'll be like, again, oh, that is so easy. So when we start talking about permissions and shares, one of the big important things that we have to remember in the Microsoft world is that there are two different types of permissions. There's what are called file permissions, and there's what are called NTFS permissions, or share permissions and NTFS permissions. It's very important to understand the difference between share permissions and NTFS permissions. Share, because they're two entirely different things. Share permissions are permissions that come into play when you share resources, files, folders, printers, over the network, right? So if I have a computer here that has a file or folder on it, if I create a share permission, anybody on the network who tries to connect to that share will have to deal with the share permission. On the other hand, if I simply sit down at the computer itself interactively, so locally, interactively, start working with that computer, the share permission for all intents and purposes doesn't exist. I don't deal with it. So share permissions are only come into play when people are accessing the resource from another computer, device, whatever, on the network. NTFS permissions are always in effect. So basically, if you try to access the file, folder, resource over the network, the permissions will be in effect. And if you sit down locally at the computer, the permissions will be in effect. So that's the first thing to realize. And there are two separate sets of permissions. There's share permissions, and then there are NTFS permissions. And they are two separate things that kind of meet and do a whole bunch of messy, ugly, nasty stuff. Now, as I talk about this, when I'm talking about permissions, again, the big problem with new people in the technology world is they convolute and they mash concepts together, and it really makes them confused. And so when they think that one thing means another thing, they get confused, and then they don't understand what's going on, and they get frustrated, and they give up, and they become florists. Well, one of the big important things to remember with permissions, we are currently talking about permissions. Permissions are how users can deal with resources on computers or on the network. Files, folders, printers, and such. We are not talking about security. So you will hear about group policy objects, local security policies. Security, it will be dealt with in a different class, and security is about what you can do to devices and computers on the network. Whether you can access the control panel, whether you can access the CD drive, whether you can access registry editor, whether you can change the background. Those are security. That's security. And that will be dealt with in a different class. Permissions and security are two really different critters. So just keep that in mind. So when we're talking about permissions here, we're talking about resources. Files, folders, printers, those types of things, and whether you can access them. So again, when we're talking about permissions, we have file and we have NTFS permissions. Now, whenever we are talking about permissions, or whenever we are going to be implementing permissions, again, as I talked about in the class on groups, we should be assigning permissions to groups and not to individual users. When you are a new computer geek, you think you want to be really cool, and what you want to do, most new computer geeks, is they want to assign permissions and security, but that's another class, to individual users. So you want to say the CEO has access to this file, this folder, and this printer. The secretary has access to this file, this folder, and has no access to this printer. So when you first start thinking about assigning permissions and future security, you are thinking about assigning those permissions to individual users. That is not how professionals do it, because that is just a horrible way to do things in environments where you're dealing with 100 users, 1,000 users, 10,000 users, or 100,000 users. If you assign individual permissions to every individual user in 100,000 users, yeah, that's not going to work. Remember, the entire point of using something like Active Directory, the entire point of using Microsoft Server ecosystem is the idea to simplify things so that whenever you have to make an administrative change, you can have that change go out to as many people as possible. Instead of changing an individual user's account, or permission, I would rather be able to make one little 30-second change that will change 1,000 accounts all at the same time. Well, how you do that is you put all users into groups, and then you assign permissions to those groups. So if you have a marketing group, you decide what files and folders and files, folders, and printers that marketing group should be able to access, and then you give the marketing group permissions to those files and folders. The accounting group decide what resources they need access to, and then give them permission to those resources. The executive group, the C-level group, figure out what they need access to and assign permissions based on that. So you want to always, almost always, 99.99999% of the time, be assigning permissions to groups, not to individual users. Very important to remember in the real world, even if it's a group of one. A group of one is a better idea than assigning individual permissions to a specific user. Because again, that user may be on a certain project. Right now they're the only person on the project, but then 3 months from now they get 5 employees. If you've assigned individual permissions to that user, now it's kind of a mess. Whereas if you put that user into a group of one, they hire 5 employees to get brought into that unit, you can now just dump those users into that group, and now they have the exact same permissions. So now the question becomes, well, if we're dumping all these users into groups, and we're giving permissions to groups, what happens when one user is a member of multiple groups? So, you have the bookkeeper, the accounting guy, the person that's there, and let's say they also have a function in the marketing department, so they are a member of the accounting group and the marketing group. What happens then to the permissions? Well, as you give permissions, you give the permission to use resources to these different groups. So you allow them the ability to read, the ability to write, the ability to list contents, all of those things. The ability, basically, it's cumulative. So if you give the marketing department read permission to a folder, and you give the bookkeeping department write permission to a folder, and you have a user that is both bookkeeping and marketing, it is cumulative, and therefore they will get read and write permission to that resource. So it's very important to remember that as you put people into multiple groups, their access becomes cumulative for whatever permissions you have given to that file, folder, or resource. The only time this is not the case is if you do the deny permission. So if you explicitly want to deny a certain group from seeing something, if you check off, as I will show you in a minute, the deny, then they will never be able to get that access to the file or folder until you change the setting. So you want to always put users into groups. Group permissions are cumulative to the better unless you do deny. Now the final thing before we start going over to the computer is that there is something called the owner of a resource. Basically, generally the owner of a folder. So the owner of a folder can assign permissions to other users. So by default, whenever you create a folder, you are the owner, or whoever created that folder is the owner. And so by default, they can give access to other people. So they can say, one person has full control, or one group has full control, and one group only has read permission. They're the ones that can assign that. Now, if you are an administrator, this may become a problem because you go in, you need to give somebody else access to a folder, but a different user created the folder, so they're the ones that are able to give permissions. What you can do is you can take ownership of the folder. It's called taking ownership. So you as the administrator, you have the rights to take ownership of folders. You can take ownership of the folder, and then you can assign other groups permissions to use the folder and the files and the resources internally. So that is what ownership is. So these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about. So we talked about, so we've got NTFS permissions and we've got share permissions. Now the important thing, basically share permissions, you don't need to think about share permissions a lot, or you shouldn't think about share permissions a lot. Mainly, you want to be dealing with NTFS permissions. So whenever you want to be restricting users or giving users access to files, folders, resources, you want to be using NTFS permissions. But you've got these share permissions that are sitting there. So you're thinking, Eli, what do we do with these share permissions? Well, the first thing that you do with the share permissions is by assigning the share permissions. This is what actually shares the file, folder, or resource out to the network. So if you give a file, folder, resource, NTFS permissions only, nobody else from the network will be able to access it because it hasn't been shared. The very act of giving share permissions to a folder or resource is what actually shares it on the network. So if you only give NTFS permissions, then if somebody sits down interactively at the computer, then those permissions will be in effect. But if somebody is at a different computer on the network, that folder or resource won't be shared, and therefore they won't be able to access it. So essentially, all you're going to be doing with a share permission is you are going to use it to share a file, folder, or resource over the network. And then what I would say to make your life easier is give everyone, the group, the permission to read and write to the folder. So if you give everyone the read-write permission to the folder, then you are not going to run into conflicts between share permissions and NTFS permissions. Because basically, if you restrict access using the share permissions, that will affect how users are able to access the files and folders and resources. So again, this gets a little complicated. Gets a little convoluted. It gets a lot of convoluted. If you're a little lost, make sure you buy the book or maybe watch this video a couple times. But basically, in general, you use a share permissions to share out the file, folder, or resource. Then you give everyone, the everyone group, the ability to read, write into that folder or resource that you've shared out. Then past that, you're only going to be using NTFS permissions in order to actually give people access or restrict access to those resources. So with that, let's go over to the computer now so I can start explaining this stuff to you guys, just so your eyes don't glaze over as you think, Eli, oh my golly, what the hell are you talking about? Okay, so here we are. We are back at my Windows Server 2012 box. So this is the one we've been using for a while. It's the etcg.com domain. So basically, it's exactly the same box I've been showing you guys for a couple classes now. And this is sitting on my virtual box within my really powerful computer. So this is a virtual machine, but this is the 2012 server. So the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to go up to Tools, and then we are going to go to Active Directory Users and Computers, because we are going to need to play with individual users, and we're going to need to play with groups. So we might as well create those now. So basically, for this little lab, I have already created all of these things, just so you don't have to watch me slog through this stuff. But basically, I have created a test user account. So this guy's username is test user, and I've created a user2 account. So these are just two individual users. Then what I've done is I've created a group called employees. If we double click on this, we can see the members of the group are test user and user2. So I created those two users, created a group called employees, and put them both into it. But then to show you how the deny works, I also created a group called bad. And if you look in here, you will see the member of the group is user2. So this may be like, if you're looking at a company, let's say this is an employee that you're thinking about firing. This is somebody who maybe they did something wrong and they're under investigation. So they have not been fired yet. On the other hand, you don't want them to get really mad and go in and just start deleting stuff willy-nilly because they hate you because they're under investigation. So they're not fired, so you don't delete the account or disable the account. They still exist, but you want to be able to restrict them from being able to access certain files and folders. So I have created the user 2. Now again, imagine if you work for a really nasty company. What you can do is you can add just a ton of different users to this bad group. So if you had 20 people under investigation, you could add 20 people to this group. So we've created test user, user 2, employees, and bad. So those are the users and groups we've created, and we do that in Active Directory users and computers. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to File Explorer, and we are going to go to Computer, and then we are going to go to our C drive. Now basically, whenever you're sharing out folders off of a server, such as a file server, most of us consider it best practice to share the folder from the root directory. Now if you created different partitions on the server, you may have a file share partition, and that's where you would share the folder out from. But for me, generally, I find it's just easiest to share from the root, just right up here in the C drive. So I have created a folder called Share. Then what I did was I shared this folder out. So if I right-click, I can go down to Properties, and first what we're looking at here is sharing. So what we can see is that I have shared this this particular folder. So it says server share. So if I click on the share, we can see that everyone has read-write permission. So this has already been shared, so I'll do cancel. So what you would do is if you would create a folder, you would come here, you would click share, you would type in everyone, you would add it, and then you would give them the read-write permission. So that is what will actually share this thing out over the network. So once we have done that, then what we can do is we can go into the folder, and we can see that I've created two different folders in here. Now these are protected by NTFS permissions. So that first one is the share out. These are now protected by NTFS permissions. So if I right click on private, I can go to properties. Now I'm going to go to security. And what we can see here is that different groups or users have been given access to this particular folder. So what I can do is I can go here to edit, just so I can show you. So system has full control, has all access to the files and folders in here. That's what we want. Now what we've done is we've said employees, anybody in the employees group has full control of the folder. This means they can add folders, they can rename folders, they can delete files, they can do whatever they want. On the other hand, anybody in the bad group, we want to deny all permissions because they're bad, 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 bad. And then we have the administrator, and then we have the administrators group. But the big one that we're dealing with, so system, administrator, and administrators, you basically just leave the same. What we've done is we've come in here and we've said employees, anybody in that employees group has full control. Anybody in the bad group is completely denied. So that's the first thing that we do. So that's where you actually give the permissions to the groups on whether you want them to be able to access the folder and its contents or not. The other thing is we can go to the Advanced tab. So this is an important one to go to. And here under the Advanced tab is where we have the ownership. So I talked about the ownership before. So as we can see, the owner of this particular folder is the administrators group, ETCG administrators. So if this was owned by a different user and we wanted to take ownership of it as administrators, we could click on the change, and then we could change who the owner of this folder is. Now, the ability to take ownership of a file or folder is a security policy. So basically, administrators are allowed to take ownership of files and folders willy-nilly, whereas average users are not. So then we can see, as we've seen, so bad is deny, system is allow, administrator, administrator, employee. So this is basically like what we were seeing before. Now the one thing down here that you should take into account, you should look at, is this inheritance. So this little button here will either say enable inheritance or disable inheritance. It's very important that you understand what inheritance is. So when we're talking about inheritance, what we're talking about when we're talking about inheritance is that the files or folders within a folder will take on the same permissions of the parent folder. So the parent folder, you assign whatever, permissions to the resources, the files and folders that are inside of it. Then the question is do the child resources, the child files and folders, what permissions are assigned to them? By default, they inherit all the permissions that you assigned to the parent. Most of the time, 90% of the time, you want the files or folders to inherit the permissions from the parent. 10% of the time, for whatever reason, you don't want them to inherit. But what the inheritance does is it says the files and folders within this folder have the exact same permissions as that parent folder. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, play with it. If you're sitting there going like, Eli, that's why you play with it. That's why you sit here for a day and you futz with permissions, and by the end of the day, it will seem very easy. I know, permissions is just one of those horrible, evil, just convoluted, nasty things, right? But anyways, so here we go, and we're back at the computer. So, cancel out of here, and then cancel out of here. So then, what I've done is I've created the public folder. If I look at the properties of the public folder, I go to security, and we see the permissions here. So we've got system, we've got employees, we've got administrator and administrators. Now, as we can see here, so we have the group for employees, and they have full control access of this folder. So they are able to get into this folder and do whatever it is they want. You will notice that the bad group is not even mentioned here. I haven't put anything here because I want the bad group to still be able to get access and have full control of whatever's in this public folder, since it's theoretically supposed to be public. So all we do is we hit OK, and that is the setup on this server so that the users can access the files and folders. So what we're going to do is we're going to minimize here, and then we're going to go up and we are going to go into my Windows 8 computer. So we can see here that we are at this Windows 8 computer. So Windows 8 Professional Computer is part of the domain, and I'm logged in as the test user. So this is the test user who is an employee and is a good employee. He has not been put into the bad persons section, right? So if I go to desktop, then I go up here to the corner and I go to search. Basically, we're going to use this little search bar just the way we used to use run. So I'm going to use UNC here, Universal Naming Convention. So // and then server. So the name of my server is server. So in order to access the shared files on the server, you do // whatever the name of the server is, and the share if you know it. For now, I'm just going to do server and hit enter. From here, we see the files or the folders that are shared on the server. So netlogon, we're not going to worry about. Sysvol, we're not going to worry about. What we care about is this share folder. So we double click on this, and now we can see private and public. If I go into private, you can see I've created folders, so I can create a folder, I can rename a folder, I can do whatever I want in here. So this is the private folder, and I can do what I want. I can go back to the share. Again, I can go into public. I can create folders. I can delete folders. So as I talked about, I have full control of whatever is in these particular folders because I am that test user that is in the group employees that has been given full control. So what I'll do now is to show you what it's like when it's restricted. I will sign out, sign in as another user, so I'll sign in as user 2. Now when I sign in, so now I'm user 2. Again, I'll go to the desktop so I can get this little search thing. I'll go to server. I'll go to share. And now you can see that only the public folder is even shown. So I can go into the public folder, and again I have full access to do whatever I want. But the private folder isn't even shown because I don't have permission to do anything to that private folder. So that's the basic concept behind these how this permission works. So that's what there is to the share permissions and the NTFS permissions. So the share permissions are what allow you to actually share the files and folders over the network. Generally, you just give everyone the read-write permission. Then the NTFS permissions are what you can go down, you can drill down and say, do I want to give somebody the ability to read, to write, to execute, to list, to do all of that kind of stuff. Now the important thing that I haven't set up till now, that I have to say, I have to scream at the top of my lungs, I think I've said this before in other classes, but got to remind you here, is that whenever you make any modifications to either permissions or security in the future, many times those changes do not come into effect until the user has logged off and logged back in. So when they log in, they will be given the access control key that will actually give them the new permission. So again, one of the big problems with newbies is they go and they make all these modifications for permissions. They forget to log the user off and log them back in, and then it doesn't seem like any of it's working. So they're like, oh, and so they just sit there for like 5 hours doing all kinds of weird stuff trying to make permissions work, when in fact all that needed to happen was for the user to log off and log back in. So whenever you make any modifications to permissions or to security, always make sure the user logs off and logs back in. So that is what there is to share permissions and NTFS permissions. This is the introduction to this permissions class, because of course in Windows 2012 they couldn't leave well enough alone, and they have made a few additional improvements to functionality. So there are some things I will show you in a different class that are unlike older versions of Windows Server, things that you can do to improve security and whatnot. But this is the basic idea for the share and NTFS permissions. Again, if you're confused, I'm telling you, permissions are one of those things. It is the cornerstone. It's one of the bedrocks to enterprise Microsoft environments. So go out, spend the $40, $50 on the book so you can read it to make sure what's going on. Because make sure, if you're confused, 1, go out and read about it, and then 2, just play with it for a day. If you spend 5 hours just hammering out permissions and playing around and trying to figure this stuff out, it'll seem easy. And you'll be like, wow, how did I not understand that before? But again, if all you're trying to do is listen to me and watch this, it may be a little confusing. So you really need the hands-on, and you really need to be able to read about this to get your head around it. So that's it. Again, don't confuse permissions with security. Permissions and security are 2 different things. And within permissions, there's the share permission, and then there are the NTFS permissions. Again, 2 different things that do kind of come together every once in a while and make a little bit of a mess. I would argue with the share permissions, simply share the folder out, share it so that the everyone group can have the read-write permission to the folder, and then from there use NTFS permissions for the underlying files and folders for the really refined security. Remember that owners of the folder are able to to change permissions for other users to be able to access that resource. And remember the inheritance. So inheritance, 90% of the time, is going to be a very good thing. So the files and folders will inherit the same permissions as the parent folder has. 10% of the time, this is absolutely not what you want to have happen, and so you have to make sure to disable inheritance and then go from there. Again, play with it. Once you play with it, it'll be very easy. So, as you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy. This was Introduction to File and Share Permissions on Windows Server 2012. As always, I enjoy teaching this class and look forward to seeing you at the next one.